cordially invite you to join us, not just for the lectures this month, but also in our other courses and programs, and information about them is available on the table in the front, but also at our website, ucollege.worcester.edu. I'm also happy to say that this year, as also last and the year before, we are indebted to the generous support of Dr. C. Barbara Miller, Washington University School of Medicine alumnus, distinguished surgeon, and innovative medical educator. I was speaking to Dr. Miller, who lives in Canada, just a week before last, on the occasion of his 96th birthday, and I was talking to him about his just published book entitled Excalibur, a modest survey and synthesis of the history of science in the modern world. Dr. Miller is a force of nature, and though he's not able to be with us this month, we look forward to seeing him here in St. Louis for the spring visit. Please join me in thanking Dr. Miller for his support of this series. Some of you will recall that we have in recent years been examining human values, beginning 2 years ago with the value of justice, and last year the quality of mercy. I note that the audience for mercy was larger than that for justice, which I guess says something about human nature, or about Americans, or maybe just about the Midwest. This year, we turn to the question of tolerance and its complex, multifarious role in both our personal and public lives. And to explore and address some of these complexities, we'll be hearing over the next 4 weeks from professors in classics, law, psychology, and literature. To start us off this morning, we're fortunate to have with us one of the most beloved teachers and colleagues on this campus, Professor of Classics, George Pepe. George has been a Latinist from an early age, beginning at Loyola High School in New York City. Yeah. Okay, we may hear about that. Then the College of the Holy Cross and finally at Princeton, where he took his PhD. He joined Washington University in 1965 and has been a crucial member of the faculty for nearly 50 years. He's a scholar and teacher of Latin literature, especially prose and Roman history and political thought, and a generous, stimulating colleague to those in many, many disciplines beyond classics. He has served on countless committees, chaired the classics department more than once, was a founding member of the Text of Tradition program for undergraduates, and also at University College has been chair and sustaining faculty member of our Master of Liberal Arts program. He's also one of Washington University's great teachers, and as Shakespeare's contemporary Ben Jonson once said of his favorite teacher, alumnus olim aeternum amicus, which, subject to George's correction, means roughly, if you've ever been a student, you'll always be his friend. We're delighted to have him here this morning, speaking on the topic of debating the altar of victory, an early discourse on the limits of tolerance.
Bob was much too generous towards me, and it's probably my fault that since I'm a terrible typist and an even worse proofreader, that I did not go to Loyola High School. I went to Regis High School. There's a big difference, although they're only separated by one block. Regis was free, and Loyola wasn't. Right? Another correction is that I really wasn't a Latinist from an early age. I was a Hellenist, but there are a lot more students taking Latin than Greek, and that's where I wound up doing. I also want to put a plug in for the MLA. This kind of course, in a way, results from my early participation in the MLA. The late and I really great Bob Salisbury, a professor of political science here, and I taught a course together in 1980 that was an eye-opener for me. You know, being in class with someone like Bob. It was a course on something like the classical roots of the American Revolution or something like that. Secondly, this is not a lecture. This is a talk. I mean, if by lecture means that I will have a prepared text and read from it, well, don't expect that. This is in some way a discourse. And the reason for that title is that that's a Latin word, but it shows its stay in France for a bit. It's discoursus in Latin, which means a running around, a running here and there. It acquires the sense of a conversation much later than in the classical period. So it either means wide-ranging, or in my case, rambling. But I will try to stay on the course as much as possible. This is really much more of a narrative talk than analytic or abstract. Some of the later talks from the look of them will explore this complex issue much more. Instead, what I'm going to fasten on and look at is a period in which, in a real sense, the notion and vocabulary of tolerance arises. Tolerance is a Latin-based word, right? So much so that when John Locke writes probably the most famous document in the history of tolerance, namely his work on tolerance, he wrote it in Latin, and it was called De Tolerantia, or he might have pronounced it De Tolerantia, right? So that it would reach a much wider audience. That term, tolerance, which comes so easily to us, however vague and contested it might be, we're going to find is actually absent in this period that I'm talking about. So that in a certain sense, the title is misleading, but anything to get a crowd. What we're talking about here is this altar of victory. This is what's assumed to be a statue of victory. Apparently, it was, the experts say, originally a statue of Venus onto which wings were attached, since that was standard for Nike, or the Greek version of victory. This is not typically a pose of victory. The wings were attached later on. This statue originally was the possession of the Greeks in the southern city of Tarentum, which the Romans, after conquering, ransacked. The Romans are probably the original art despoilers. They knew a good thing when they saw it, and they decided to take it with them. So they brought the statue to Rome, roughly in the year 275 BC. Now, I will use BC and AD. I know this will raise hackles in some people and is somewhat incorrect today. The reason to do it, and similarly I will use the word pagan, which some people also take offense at. I'll use pagan because there really isn't any term other than pagan to describe non-Christians and non-Jews in the ancient world. You're either a Christian or a Jew or a pagan. Christian, you could be an Orthodox or a heretic. Right? So pagans really cover everybody else other than, when I say the ancient world, I mean the Roman Empire. The reason for the AD is that's a construction of the 5th century or 6th of, I think, of a Latin Christian monk, Dionysius Exiguus. Apparently he was very short. And he came up with a dating system based on really the Christian, we might say, dispensation. So before that date, there was no way to refer to, at least in terms of a year, one had to use a non-Christian dating scheme. In some sense, what this talk is about is the transition in a way, mentality and in other respects from paganism to Christianity. So that's one reason to use, sort of AD. So 275, it is brought to Rome, and if you have the handout, you can look at it. Some of the dates are here, because I'm going to be moving around a bit, so to give you some anchor points. It was brought into the Senate House, the Curia of Rome, by the Emperor Augustus. He wasn't actually Augustus then, but we use that name for him. It's a name that will be given to him in about a year after that, to commemorate his great victory over Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium. You may remember it. Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor flee. So he brought the statue in and set it on an altar inside the Senate House, and it apparently became customary for meetings of the Roman Senate to begin with senators making some kind of a ritual act, perhaps sprinkling incense, making a prayer, and then entering their proceedings. I mean, it might be analogous to what goes on in the halls of Congress, where each day begins with some kind, apparently, of religious invocation, at least of the creeds that are tolerated, that is, or at least recognized. So that was, that's sort of the altar. What we're talking about is an incident that happened roughly almost 400 plus years later. The year now is 384 AD. And while much has changed, much is the same since Augustus established the altar of victory. The empire has grown. It has weathered some significant disasters, to put it mildly, in the previous century, but it's been stabilized. The Roman Empire at this time extends from the borders of Scotland across Europe, roughly everything west of the Rhine River and south of the Danube, all the way to the Black Sea, across North Africa, basically in the habitable part, and then into Asia, most of present-day Turkey, Lebanon, what's left of Syria, Israel, Egypt, and a little bit of Iraq. So a vast, vast territory, and yet housing only about probably 70 million people. Right? To give a comparison, there's roughly 70 million people today in Italy. We assume there were assume on the basis of very, sort of inadequate information, that there were 7 million people in Italy, roughly in the period that we're talking about. The empire has been divided administratively into a west and an eastern part. This was done roughly 100 years before our date for basically efficiency purposes. It was too vast for one man to control, but also to avoid, we think, one of the problems that have beset the empire: factionalism among competing generals. This way, apparently, the pie being sliced up, people would be more satisfied. In addition, each of the generals or the emperors in the East and the West had a subordinate who would be expected to replace them, so that it also would handle the issue of succession. Right? That system had been in place, as I say, for about 100 years. They had undergone a bit of a disruption in the sense that what it was meant to avoid, civil war, it had failed to do. There had been a civil war in the period around 310, and the victor was, as some of you may know, Constantine, right? The first avowedly Christian emperor in the Roman Empire. Constantine dies in the year 337. We'll look at his Edict of Milan in a little bit, succeeded by his sons. And again, despite a slight interruption, in our period, there still are two emperors, one in the West and one in the East. But the one in the West is a child. His father, the Emperor Valentinian, had died in 375 and was succeeded by his son Valentinian II. Right? The emperor in the East is a powerful military figure his name is Theodosius, actually from Spain. Theodosius had become emperor because the previous emperor, Valens, Valentinian II's uncle, had gotten himself and apparently a significant portion of the Eastern Roman Empire massacred or defeated at the Battle of Adrianople in 378, a battle which from our standpoint now is often regarded as, in a way, the death knell of the Roman Empire, that from that point on it will be on the defensive. But that doesn't seem to have impressed people at the time, as we're looking at this, obviously from our standpoint. So we have an emperor in the West, Valentinian II, and then Theodosius in the East. Valentinian II had succeeded his brother Gratian. Gratian had made certain legislation affecting the altar of victory and other prominent aspects of the pagan religion. He had ordered the altar of victory removed from the Senate House. This wasn't the first time it had happened. It had happened about 20 years before, but it had been restored. He orders the altar removed, and he also orders subsidies, financial support for some key aspects of the pagan religion, the Vestal Virgins and certain of the priests. Right? The financial support while it may play a role in this, in the sense that, so it's all about money, is not all that significant, so that this is not, primarily a financial issue. That these were vestiges or aspects of paganism which Gratian decided had to be eliminated, removed from public life. something he does in the late 370s. He dies in 378, as it is succeeded by his half-brother, Valentinian II. It's at this time, roughly in these early years, right after this period, that we hear what comes up, the other participant in this episode, or even call it a drama, Quintus Aurelius Symmachus, a Roman senator and pagan of distinguished family, very wealthy, extremely well-educated, fluent in Greek, with properties in Italy, Sicily, and North Africa, like most of the elite Roman senators. Symmachus was at this time the prefect of the city of Rome, and for reasons that we quite don't understand and are much sort of argued over, the Senate, which apparently means, which indicates that the Senate at this time was probably still a majority non-Christians or pagans, decides to make a request to the emperor that the altar be restored. The emperor is not in Rome. He is in Milan, right, in the north of Italy. Milan is much more strategically located for the military pressures that the empire was facing, coming from both the Rhine and the Danube. And, so that while Rome is obviously still the capital and the seat of the Bishop of Rome, Pope Damascus at this time, the emperor is north. So Symmachus attempts to go north and make a plea. Right? He is refused. He is not allowed admission. Right? Things change. Again, we don't have to go into the details. A few years later, and the request is granted. He goes north and delivers what was called a relatio, a report of the sense of the Senate that the altar be restored. And we have a copy of that. Right? In effect, it's a speech. And we're going to look at some of its contents as to the reasons he gives for this restoration. And the suspense, he will not use the word toleration in his plea. Right? And then I'll try to explain why, for good reason, he doesn't use that word in what he's asking of the emperor. His effort is countered by a letter from the then Bishop of Milan, Ambrosius, right, or Ambrose of the Hill. Ambrose had become he had become bishop in the 370s. He has a similar background to Symmachus. That is, he is elite, upper class, extremely well educated, and well connected. By contrast, those of you that have read Augustine's Confessions, right, know that Augustine makes contact with Ambrose when Augustine is promoted to become the professor of rhetoric in Milan as the main sort of imperial seat. Augustine's background is middle class, maybe slightly upper middle class. He's from North Africa. He never took to Greek. And while he will become a bishop and obviously one of the foundational pillars of Christianity, at this, the social gap between him and Ambrose is significant. Ambrose writes a letter. It's not clear that he was able to read this letter to Valentinian, but he certainly made it known to him. Ambrose's relations to Valentinian is much disputed. Some have argued that Gratian and then Valentinian II were in effect puppets of Ambrose, and they were really carrying out church policy. There seems to be good evidence that that's not the case, right? But Ambrose's letter, whether because of it or independently, the result was not successful. The altar was not restored, nor were the subsidies restored to the Vestal virgins. Now, what I want to do now is sort of I made this, a strategic move on my part, is not so much look at the contents of the letter, but instead look at certain aspects of what we call government, the policy of the Roman government, both under the Roman Republic and under the Empire, towards religion. Because it is significantly different from, that should come as no surprise, from the practices today, which are really outgrowths of efforts begun much sooner, even before John Locke. And the attitude and practices of the government toward religion has a bearing on both the way this debate was conducted and also its outcome. One way to start is that in the ancient world, there is no, one could say, freedom of religion, or there is no right to worship as you choose, independent of the right granted you by the state. Right? Religion is not, in a way, a kind of separate activity from the act of being a citizen. There is no separation, one could say, between church and state. The wall that, much, controversial wall that exists between church and state simply did not exist. Officials of the religion were usually political figures who were elected. The religious activity was communal. Right? The gods who were worshipped in various ways were seen as powerful, somewhat fickle, and important in human affairs, and therefore they had to be appeased and sacrificed to. This attitude is pervasive. If you look at, for example, a speech, Socrates' famous apology, in which he was charged with impiety, right, for, quote, not believing in the gods of the city. Socrates does not counter that by saying, it's none of your business, right? My right to believe. Instead, he says that that's nonsense. I believe in the gods of the state. And in fact, in various places in Plato and also Xenophon, who also has narratives about Socrates' life, Socrates is shown to be almost superstitious. I mean, he worships the gods, he consults oracles. Right? The seriousness of this part of the being in good with the gods and practicing the religion of the state can also be seen in Plato, before we turn to the Romans. Plato's last work, The Laws, which is a blueprint for what Plato might have regarded as a workable, improved society as opposed to the fantasy of the Republic, contains a strict provision regarding atheism. Right? Atheism is not to be allowed. And atheism is not the denial of the gods, or that they don't exist. It's the denial that the universe is ordered by the gods. The gods represent, one could say, an ordered frame of reference. They are also there to sustain, one could say, proper behavior as punishers. In Plato, in the city of the Laws, in fact, someone avowing what's described as atheism, that is a view that the gods are indifferent to us, even if they do exist, that they just spectate and watch us, right? Like flies to wanton boys, to borrow, maybe misuse Shakespeare's phrase. People who hold those views are subject first to a kind of, we might think, brainwashing, but an effort to have them change their minds by rational argument, by persuasion. That failing, they are given a choice of either leaving the city or facing capital punishment. Right? So, there's philosophical, in some sense, basis for some of the things that we're going to see operating with regard to the relations between Roman authorities and the Christians. Roman practices with regard to religion, and here we might want to look just at some of the documents I gave you, if I can find them. The Romans thought of themselves not unsurprisingly, as extraordinarily religious, and attributed much of their success, that is, that they had conquered most of the Mediterranean, as we'll see at the time of this first quotation, due not only to superior military training and to the disciplina, the fortitude and virtues of the citizens, but to the support of the gods. And some of that support of the gods was hard-earned, won by Roman observance of the traditional religion. Even outsiders were impressed with this. So the first example I give you there is from the Greek historian Polybius, writing around the middle of the 2nd century BC. Polybius writes an account of how is it that Rome achieved what the Greeks, he being a Greek, failed to achieve, mastery over the Mediterranean. And this is one explanation he gives. He has other reasons for it, but and they actually are sort of mainly cultural as well as, one could say, military. For I conceive that what in other nations is looked upon as a reproach, I mean a scrupulous fear of the gods, is the very thing which keeps the Roman commonwealth together. But the fear of the gods, I think what he means by that is the Romans regarded the primary purpose of their public worship, the maintenance of the Pax Deorum, P-A-X, peace with the gods. That is, they treat the gods almost as if they were a foreign power, and there needed to be some kind of almost a treaty relations with them. You obtain the peace of the gods by dealing with them in the proper way, giving them what they deserve and wanted, i.e. sacrifice and worship, on the belief that the gods do intervene and are therefore of significance. To such an extraordinary height is this carried among them, both in private and public business, that nothing could exceed this. Many people might think this unaccountable, but in my opinion, their object is to use it as a check upon the common people. I mean, it's close to saying that religion is the opium of the masses. Keep in mind that when Marx penned that, Marx had an MA in classics. It's another one of the distinguished students that the classics have turned out. He wrote an MA thesis, in fact, on the philosopher Epicurus, whom Dante puts in one of the levels of hell, in part because Epicurus was regarded as an atheist in antiquity, even though he argued that the gods do exist, but he saw them as indifferent. They basically are out there in outer space, having nothing much else to do than contemplate us, but they don't intervene, right, in human affairs. So that may be what he is talking about here, Polybius, that Greeks have become so sophisticated that this aspect of religion, that is, gods who are involved in the world, gods who have emotions. We need to sacrifice because they get angry. We need to sacrifice individually because at the end of life we may face punishment. Philosophers regarded that as preposterous, that gods cannot have human passions. They would not be divine. Polybius, what seems to be also at work here, makes a distinction that was often made, that there are really three kinds of religions. There's the religion of the poets, which you can find in Greek tragedy. There's the religion of the politicians, which I think is what he's talking about. And then there's the religion of the philosophers. The religion of the philosophers is purified. Those gods are like Aristotle's unmoved mover, not a god that one could worship, not a god that one could love, not a god that one could fear. Right? But the gods of the politicians, right, those are the gods that count. Right? Therefore, a politician, right, or a statesman, whatever his personal beliefs about the gods, had best be a fan of the old-time religion. And we'll see that actually carried out in the case of Cicero. Right? But seeing, right, if it were possible to form a state wholly of philosophers, imagine what that would look like, such a custom would perhaps be unnecessary. I shouldn't have said that because that puts me in with Bill Buckley, but seeing that every multitude is fickle and full of lawless desires, unreasoning anger, and violent passions, the only resource is to keep them in check by mysterious terrors and scenic efforts of this sort. It's obvious that Polybius did not expect that this text would be read by the people that was directed against, but only at members of the Roman elite. And we find similar quotes here. This is a longer, I won't read the whole thing, from the Roman historian Livy, writing toward roughly contemporaries with Emperor Augustus. Here he's, however, talking about a much earlier period in Roman history. There was a great distress and a drought. And you can see precisely the kind of problem that we're going to see that religion is dealt with or could deal with. And if you go about halfway down, but superstition in various kinds, and most of them of foreign growth, took possession of their minds. Persons to whom minds enslaved by superstition were source of gain, introducing by pretending to divination new modes of sacrifice, until a sense of public shame now reached the leading men of the state, seeing in all the streets and chapels extraneous and unaccustomed ceremonies of expiation for the purpose of obtaining the favor of the gods. A charge was then given to the aediles, minor officials, that they should see that no other than Roman gods should be worshipped, nor in any other manner save that of the country. Right? Or to put it in more succinctly, as Cicero will do, right, or had done actually a few years before in a work he wrote roughly 5 or 6 years before Caesar was assassinated, a work called On the Laws, in a way modeled on Plato's book. No person shall have any separate gods, nor new ones, nor shall he privately worship any strange gods, unless they be publicly allowed, i.e. receive government authorization. Privately, they shall worship the gods whose worship has been handed down in its proper form by their forefathers. So the obligation upon you is to worship the traditional gods. But you can worship new gods if they have been permitted. And the Romans did permit new gods. There's a ceremony that we know of roughly 150 years before this, in which during the course of the Second Punic War, which Rome was severely tested by the great Carthaginian general Hannibal, Rome sought an alliance with the powerful city of Pergamum in roughly present-day, I guess, Turkey. And to cement that alliance, the Romans introduced into Rome the worship of the goddess Cybele, Cybele. A large black stone, perhaps a meteorite, was brought into Rome, and a temple was built for her. I think it's a scene that appears in 2001. But it had to receive authorization, right? There were other, and even a religion that was introduced had to also at the same time be kept within bounds. We know that the worship of the god Dionysus or Bacchus, there's a famous incident that Livy also records in which certain activities associated with the religion became suspect. There was apparently, they might have had political overtones, crime, there were in one part, crimes and other charges which may not have been substantial were investigated. Certain people were arrested and eventually executed. But the worship was not eradicated, right? The Bacchus had been introduced. It was legitimate. It just had to be practiced in a way consistent, one could say, with Roman law or consistent with the maintenance of order and peace. Right? So the Romans were what we might say tolerant, but that's not the word they used. The word they will use is, can this religion be in a way safely or usefully introduced into Roman society? Some religions, sort of straddled the line. Right? One key factor was this a religion that had stood the test of time? Was it a religion of a people, right? And this especially applies in the case of Judaism. The Romans, if we take the words we hear from people like Cicero and Tacitus, did not have a high regard for Judaism or the Jews. And yet, Judaism was a religion that was allowed in Rome and tolerated. Again, I'm using that word in a way anachronistically. Here's a quote from the Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the end of the 1st century AD, Josephus, as some of you may know, was a participant in the First Roman War, the revolt that occurred in Judea in 66 against Nero. Can be regarded in a way as a turncoat. He was captured by the Romans, changed sides, and became, in some sense, a supporter of at least Roman rule. He's talking here about Caesar and says, Julius Gaius, praetor and consul of the Romans, to the officers, council, and people of the Parians, the Greek island in the Aegean. Greetings, the Jews in Delos and some other Jews who passed through there have told us in the presence of your envoys that by degrees you forbid them to follow their ancestral customs and ways of worship. I do not want such decrees made against our friends and allies. The Jews had helped Caesar, right, in the war against Pompey, just as the Jews will also help Octavian/Augustus in the war against Anthony, so that this is being done out of, one could say, reasons of state, as well as that this is a traditional religion, right? While forbidding other religious assemblies, I permit this people to assemble and celebrate according to their ancestral customs and laws. If you have made any decree against these, our friends and allies, abrogate them because of their virtue and goodwill towards us. This permission, this allowance of Jewish worship will continue under even the Christian Roman emperors, but for different reasons, right? Reasons having to do with the very complex and fragile relationship between Judaism and Christianity. But its first appearance here suggests, how kind of a litmus test that had to be passed by, quote, a new religion, right? One thing is, it couldn't be that new, right? It had to be old. It had to be established and ancestral. This was precisely the problem with Christianity. It was not an old religion. It was a new religion, and it was not a religion of any people, right? That is, it did not have political confines. From the Roman standpoint, in fact, Christians were turncoats. They had abandoned the religion of their fathers, right? They were not members of a populace, right? Christians, in a way, well, we won't go into it, sort of feed into this. But that's going to really be, in some sense, the grounds for the policy of the Roman government towards Christians, right? This is not a religion that they will allow, right? So that if you go to the timeline, you can see that the first incident, the most famous one, is that in the year 64, right, Nero's persecution of the Christians after the Great Fire of Rome. Now that's very tendentious. From Nero's standpoint, it was a prosecution, right? That these people, even though the pagan writers about Nero, describing this scene, suggest that Nero was scapegoating the Christians, but at the same time, that a major source for this shows no love for the Christians. And if they don't deserve to be punished for the fire, well, they deserve it for just being Christians, is what it's going to come down to. There's no indication that there was any imperial-wide policy with regarding Christians. There's a famous, I didn't give you any examples of it, it's probably, I don't think I did anyway, exchange that takes place in the year 110 between the then Emperor Trajan, his column is still standing near the Roman Forum, and his provincial governor that he sent out to a part of what now is northern Turkey, Pliny, one of John Garganigo's ancestors from the city of Comum in northern Italy. Pliny writes to Trajan asking for instructions about how to handle Christians. Pliny himself has already been dealing with Christians and has Christians that have been brought to him. It's not clear that he's gone out of his way to arrest or apprehend them, but when they've been brought to him, he has asked if they are Christians. If they admit that they are, he gives them a chance to recant. The recanting is that they have to perform some act of sacrifice, an acknowledgement of the Roman gods. Refusal to do that is then followed immediately by punishment, capital punishment, if the worshiper is not a Roman citizen. If the worshiper is a Roman citizen, then like Paul, the citizen will be sent to Rome, there apparently to also await punishment. The basis that Pliny has operated under is that as the governor, his main responsibility is to preserve order in the province, to see that taxes are collected and that Roman troops are not needed to quell disorder. Right? Christians, in carrying out those functions, he has what the Romans regard as the power of coercitio, restraint. The Romans are very deficient, as modern experts will say, on the question of criminal law. And law was whatever the official, a crime was often what an official determined was a crime. Illegal gatherings, suspicious activity that might be promoting public unrest. Christians apparently could be, the way Pliny seems to be operating under is not some imperial decree, but his own sense that the presence and activity of Christians is harmful to the interests of the Roman state. We obviously, it may be difficult for us to conceive of that, but if one thinks of the mindset with which religion is approached, it's by someone like Pliny, it becomes, I think, more, in a way, understandable. That seems to remain the policy. We hear of sporadic arrests and martyrs from the period 110 through the middle of the next century. The activity of the officials was, as you can say, erratic, and this is a reason why, if you look on the next page of documents, I've given you a selection from the Christian writer Tertullian. Tertullian is a North African writing around the year 200, very vigorous in his Latin and also in his tone of argumentation. He makes an argument here in the so-called apology on behalf of the Christians and on behalf of Christianity, challenging the kind of inconsistent and arbitrary action of the Romans with regard to Christianity. And this is the plea that he makes. You'll see some similarity between it and actually when we get to Symmachus. Let one man worship God, another Jupiter. Let one lift suppliant hands to the heavens, another to the altar of fides, trust, reliability. Let one, if you choose to take this view of it, count in prayer the clouds, and another the ceiling panels. Let one consecrate his own life to his God, and another that of a goat. For see that you do not give a further ground for the charge of irreligion by taking away religious liberty. That is, taking away religious liberty apparently means that people would desert, in his case he thinks Christianity, and might then take up sort of ungrounded religions. By taking away religious liberty and forbidding free choice of deity, so that I may no longer worship according to my inclination, but am compelled to worship against it. Not even a human being would care to have unwilling homage rendered him. In fact, we alone are prevented having a religion of our own. We give offense to the Romans. We are excluded from the rights and privileges of Romans because we do not worship the God of Rome. It is well that there is a God of all, whose we all are, whether we will or no. But with you, liberty is given to worship any God but the true God, as though he were not rather the God all should worship, to whom all belong. Now, while the argument there will, I think, reappear in later centuries as one of the reasons to grant religious tolerance, i.e. to grant religious freedom, the word tolerance is never used by Tertullian. What he's arguing instead for is religious liberty on the basis that Romans are acting unjustly. They are treating Christians unequally, unfairly, differently from other religions. He does add this note that religious liberty, and I guess there's a kind of implicit, the Romans should be granting this freedom to Christians, because he will argue in the rest of the work there is nothing harmful in this religion. Christians are law-abiding, Christians are respectful, following the injunctions of Paul. They pay taxes, right? And they observe, they are in fact are more loyal than you sort of suggest, more loyal in a way almost subservient than non-Christians. The argument apparently, fell on deaf ears in the sense that there was no relaxation of the restrictions against Christianity. The key, what then happens, and we're only going to try to do this a little more quickly, is that in 245 or 249 begins the persecution of Decius. Decius was the Roman emperor. The year before, the Romans had celebrated the 1,000th anniversary of Rome, right? From its traditional foundings, as they felt in the year 753. It may be in line with that, and also because of the distress that the empire was in, that to try to tie it more closely together, perhaps also to look for a kind of, again, a scapegoat responsible for the difficulties the empire faced, that Decius passes or legislates what can be called an empire-wide ban on certain kinds of Christian activities. I'm not going to go into details of it. It's repeated by the next emperor, Valerian, but then suspended, indicating that it was either ineffective or was causing more harm than any good. So that after these empire-wide prosecutions, the situation reverts to what it had been, namely, as a Christian, you didn't know whether you were going to be subjected to punishment or not. It all seemed to have depended upon the people you lived with, if they were to protest and cause an uprising and report you to a Roman authority, or if you were in a province where the governor had, for whatever reason, an animus against Christians. And we know that in some places Christians lived undisturbed for several centuries, whereas in other places there are these outbursts that almost seem like pogroms, where there's a lashing out against Christians, and then it peters out. The period the things really changed then in the year 303. This is under the reign of the Emperor Diocletian, who had instituted the division of the empire into two parts. He also, among many other reforms that he introduced, he started up what is often referred to as the Great Persecution, a serious effort to weaken and eradicate Christianity by going after the officials and after his bishops and other clergy, and also after the sacred books. Again, from what we know about it, it was not consistently carried out. In some places, in fact, it seems to have been totally ignored. In any event, it was suspended and in fact revoked by the Emperor Galerius in 311. And this is often described as the first edict of toleration. Right? And I've given you a little bit, trying to get away from that, of Galerius's edict. This is on the same page with Tertullian. Galerius says, in view of our most, he's talking of himself, of course, mild clemency and the constant habit by which we are accustomed to grant indulgence to all, we thought that we ought to grant our most proper indulgence also to these, so that they may again be Christians and may hold their conventicles, their meetings, provided that they do nothing contrary to good order. Right? There was no chance of that. But we shall tell the magistrates in another letter what they ought to do. Wherefore, for this our indulgence, they ought to pray to their God for our safety, for that of the republic and for their own, that the republic may continue uninjured on every side, and that they may be able to live securely in their homes. The reason that Galerius gives for, in fact, suspending and the persecution and for allowing Christians to worship is that it hasn't worked. Not only have they not become, not only have Christians not become, let's say, worship the traditional gods, but they also are not worshiping their own God, and that this could have harmful effects on the empire, and therefore they should go back to doing what religion is supposed to do, to win the favor of the gods. So this is based not on any notion of, one could say, religious liberty. It's based purely on utility. Right? It is of benefit and use to the empire that even this religion also should be practiced. The next is within a few, Galerius, when dies, and at the same time there was a civil war going on between competing would-be emperors. The victor is Constantine. And as you may remember, there's a famous book called Edict of Milan that is delivered at Milan by Constantine. It's actually by Constantine and a fellow emperor, Licinius. It's much longer than Galerius's, you can see some of it. I mean, I've given you from it, and just look at again some parts of it that, because he will actually use the phrase in here about religious, close to use the word freedom, right? So when you see that this has been granted, namely that Christians free and unrestricted opportunity of religious worship, we'll know that we've conceded the right of open and free observance of their worship for the sake of the peace of our times, and each one may have the free opportunity to worship as he pleases. This regulation is made that we may not seem to detract from any dignity or any religion. Right? Moreover, in the case of the Christians especially, we esteemed it best to order that if it happens anyone heretofore has bought from our treasury from anyone else whatsoever those places where they were previously accustomed to assemble, concerning which a decree has been made, they shall be restored to the Christians without payment. So this moves a little much more beyond Galerius. Not only is Christianity going to be tolerated, it is going to, in a sense, be aided to get back on its feet. That if property has been lost, it's going to be restored. This is then part of what Constantine will do for the remaining years of his fairly long reign. He dies in 337. He will be sole emperor from 324 on. Various pieces of legislation to support and, in a way, extend Christianity. Some pieces also to weaken paganism, right? The building of churches, the construction of really now a kind of Christian purified city, Constantinople, present-day Istanbul, right, which used to be Byzantium, an intervention in controversies within Christianity, and a final baptism, probably at the end of his life, not inconsistent with practices of other Christians. So from this point on, not only is Christianity allowed, but it is in some sense in the driver's seat, and that we can see that paganism is in some way there seems to be a kind of coexistence that this decree envisions, but it's clear where his sympathies lie. That's roughly the situation where we are when we come to Symmachus and Ambrose's debate, if we want to call it that, about the altar of victory. Now the shoe is on the other foot. It is the pagans who need to ask for acceptance and permission to tolerate their religion to practice their religion as they regularly have practiced it, i.e. the altar should be restored and the subsidies also to be restored. The argument that Symmachus makes, while it's a speech that certainly was regarded highly in its own day and at least taken seriously by Christians, because not only is this the rejoinder from Ambrose, there is a poem of several thousand lines written against Symmachus called Contra Symmachum by the first, in a way, true Christian poet, the Spaniard Prudentius. In the poem, Symmachus is praised as a decent, cultured man, but one totally in error when it comes to religion. In Symmachus's speech, the part that stands out, and that's, I think it's on the top of this, I think I give it, maybe it's on the timeline. There should be two Latin quotes. The first one is from Symmachus, and it's, I think, surely such a great mystery is not reached by only one road. Is there? Tam grande secretum, right. Yeah. That line appears in the speech and is probably the only line of Symmachus that most, even students of Latin literature, know about, since he's generally not read, right? Because he falls in this kind of gray area where classics ends and, in a way, this whole new field of late antique studies begins. That line occurs in a part of the speech where Symmachus imagines Rome to be present, right? Rome is old, right? And makes an appeal, right, to the emperors. And this is the quote I've given you. "Let us now suppose that Rome is present and addresses you in these words. Excellent princes." There really are three people being addressed here. There's Valentinian II, the Emperor Theodosius, and the Emperor Theodosius' son, Arcadius, right, who is, even though he's only a child, has been elevated to imperial status in the idea that he is going to succeed, and he will succeed, and become emperor in the East. "Respect my years, to which pious rites have brought me. Let me use the ancestral ceremonies. Don't make me walk with a cane. No, let me live after my own fashion, for I am free. This worship subdued the world to my laws." I know that what Rome has accomplished. So Rome is imagined to be pleading, to sort of like go on the way it has gone on. "We ask then for peace for the gods of our fathers and of our country. It is just that all worship should be considered as one." Same note that I think is in the Tertullian. "We look on the same stars. The sky is common. The same world surround us. What difference does it make by what pains each seeks the truth? We cannot attain to so great a secret by one road. But this discussion is rather for persons at ease. We now offer prayers, not conflict." An admission that this is a request, right? It's almost as if we're not going to try to debate the issue. "May the unseen guardians of all sects be favorable to your graces. God, Zeus, Yahweh, right? And may they especially blah, blah, blah. We ask for that state of religious matters which preserve the empire, right, and furnished, right, responsible for where we are today. It's moving, but it's basically just a sentimental argument, right? Preserve the past. The past has brought us to this point. He doesn't deal with any of the, one could say, controversies that preceded it between Christianity and paganism. It's moving in part, I guess, because we can all sort of see this as sort of, the end of a certain, a phase in sort of human history. There's, just to give you an example, a recent publication, "The Last Pagans of Rome." So this is, it's a topic of interest, and especially, today, I guess, for many reasons. But it really, well, I guess what I want to make is also, it is not, in a way, it is a plea for tolerance, but does not use the vocabulary of tolerance, and I'll try to address that in a second. Ambrose's reply is, I think, devastating, right? What it basically comes down to is, right, we should not preserve the old just because it's old, right? We should move on to the things that are new, right? The old, in addition, was wrong, right? This is right, right? Ambrose can actually use the Romans against themselves, because Roman writers had recognized that what had been responsible for their success was their own efforts. And people like Polybius and Roman writers recognized that the gods were purely serving a kind of social, political function and did not really defeat Hannibal. It was the Romans who defeated Hannibal, and maybe mistakes that Hannibal made on his own. So, and Ambrose, of course, and this is where the real split occurs. Ambrose will say, there is one road, and we have it, and we know it. And we know it because we have it from God. There's a bridge here. Not a bridge. There is a divide here over which there is no bridge. Right, as some people, people have said. This is a completely now sort of changed mentality. Symmachus may be coming from building on kind of the ancient skepticism, that the same line or something like it is used by skeptical philosophers against dogmatic philosophers. How can there be any certainty in this matter, right? the response that comes from Ambrose is there is certainty, and therefore we cannot tolerate, this or allow this kind of diversity. The other reason for it is that the word tolero in Latin, the verb, and these two nouns are always used in what could be called negative senses. Tolerantia in classical Latin means endurance, right? It's the ability to put up with difficult circumstances, hunger, pain, grief, cold. It seems to be connected with a related verb, tolo, to lift up, right, with two L's, and then tolero would have the sense of to shoulder, that a burden placed on your shoulder you could endure, right? To ask for, it seems to me, therefore, to ask for tolerance would be to admit that you were defective, right? That you were bad, right? That there was some, shortcoming about you. Well, you got to put up with me. No, this is something I can't do anything about. So instead, like Tertullian and even here, what you ask for is justice. You ask for forgiveness, or you ask for clemency. You ask for indulgence from a powerful official. But you don't ask for tolerance, right? Because the word wouldn't make any sense. I can only find one instance in which it's used of a person, right? And then that they tolerated, they did not tolerate someone, and what you would expect, they did not tolerate this person, so in a military context, because he was cruel and vindictive, right? So, I mean, that may seem simple-minded on my part, but I think that's really what it comes down to. How the word changes, and we can get to our kind of modern sense, is indicated by the second note, or the second little quotation that I've given you on that sheet. That is the Latin phrase that appears in certain canonical writers, that is Roman jurists writing in the Middle Ages, right? And the phrase they use is malus tolerator ut malum tolerator ut maius tollatur. Some of it is meant to catch, I mean, they're still under the influence of ancient rhetoric, right, and of the sound play. And evil is tolerated in order that a greater evil be removed. Tolerator tollatur. The precedent for this, in a way, is already in Augustine. Right? He, in one place, talks about permitting or tolerating prostitution, an evil. Why should it be tolerated? Because not to tolerate it would bring, as a consequence, greater harm. Adultery, fornication, venereal disease. I mean, he just recites sort of that list. Interestingly enough, in the Middle Ages, that same argument is used with tolerantia to allow prostitution. Right? That word then also gets, in the Middle Ages, gets applied to, and this is, I mean, I'm in a way out of my depth here, but it gets applied to Muslims and Jews. Muslims and Jews are to be tolerated, right? But heretics are not to be tolerated. Heretics are to be treated like Plato would treat atheists. They are to be, if necessary, executed. An activity that had already begun in the period we're talking about since the year 385, 1 year after this debate, the Christian heretic Priscillian was executed in Spain by civil authority. This did not sit well with Ambrose. He regarded this as going beyond what was right. So we shouldn't think of that sort of the Inquisition begins in antiquity. The roots of it may be there in the hostility towards both paganism and especially towards heresy. But the notion of tolerance also in a way has its roots in the ancient world. I think then in the sense of where Augustine, especially both in that there and also in the struggles he had with regard to the proper treatment of heretics, right, especially Donatists. Augustine eventually will go down on the side of coercion, right, but there seems to be enough wiggle room there to allow, he starts to make distinctions in a way also there between heretics and, for example, the Jews that will come to fruition later on. So that so what I therefore would want, in a way, the point of this is the vocabulary isn't there to talk about tolerance. And when we start to think about it, one of the, it in a way is something that also applies to our own, the ambiguous nature of tolerance today, right? That is, what the motive is behind the tolerance. They were fairly clear when we get that phrase, that tolerance was to avoid greater evil. And therefore it meant to put up with something that was different and threatening. For us today, there's such a variety to what the word means. Acceptance, indifference, permission, that it'll be worthwhile to come and hear the remaining talks to be enlightened, because you're not going to be enlightened by me about it. Thank you. Anybody, questions, clarifications, corrections, willingly entertained? Sure.
When Augustus brought the altar of victory back to Rome, was he changing Roman politics, the Roman religion of politics, by elevating himself, his victory, and sort of deifying now the office of emperor?
Well, he doesn't deify the office of emperor. I mean, there is. I mean, Roman officials had been receiving what could be called cult worship in the East much earlier than Augustus. And some of that was just that it was a carryover of the way people had behaved in the East towards previous conquerors. You wanted to be on their good side. Augustus goes out of his way, I think, to make clear that this is not a personal victory, but a victory of Rome, of the Roman Republic, or the Roman state against foreign forces. In the 8th book of Virgil's Aeneid, there's a description of the shield that Aeneas gets. This is an imitation of what happens in Homer's Iliad, where Achilles has a shield built for him. Achilles' shield has generic scenes on it of farming, marriage, courts. Aeneas' shield is a cartoon of Roman history, right? And in the center of it is the Battle of Actium, right, that this commemorates. And in the battle, on one side, there is Augustus in his ships, right, even though he probably was seasick during the battle. And on the other side is Antony and Cleopatra fleeing. In support of Augustus is the god Apollo, right? A Greek god, but acceptable to the Romans, sort of providing the breath that's filling up the sails of Augustus's ship. And Cleopatra is fleeing with her gods, Anubis and these other, and they're depicted as strange animals. In addition, the Romans had been putting victory on coins under the Republic, along with other gods like Fides. So I don't necessarily see this as, there's clearly much that's revolutionary about, there's some things that's revolutionary about Augustus, but I don't think, in terms of that this particularly, would stand out that way. I'm trying to think about scenes in what we know about the Senate. The Senate House had been burned down and rebuilt. It's going to be rebuilt again. The ancient sources just, they don't make that much of a to-do, about it. And some of this has got to do with the attitude toward either the Roman attitude toward emperors. Christians writing about Roman emperors will distinguish between good emperors and bad emperors. Good emperors are ones who don't persecute, bad emperors persecute. So Nero is a bad emperor, Domitian is a bad emperor. Since much of Roman history is written by members of the Roman Senate, their attitude seems to be good emperors are emperors who take into consideration the Senate, don't what's the right word? Don't harass. So Nero is bad, Domitian is bad, but Augustus, Trajan, those are exemplary emperors. So it's a long answer to say, I don't, in addition, because he wasn't worshipped, and when even in the East, his worship was tied to the goddess Roma, right? It's true that Romans, that the emperors upon death are deified, right? They become gods and receive cult, but that doesn't happen during their lifetime, especially in the West. In addition, if you look at something like Cicero's, he writes a version, the reason why we call Plato's Republic the Republic, since there's nothing Republican or Democratic about it. In fact, there's no politics in the Republic, because it's to get rid of politics, to create a healthy state of affairs. Cicero writes a work which he calls De Republica, and we use that title to refer, I think, misleadingly to Plato's, but that's the way it is. At the end of that of Cicero, his character that he's talking about imagines a dream in which his father and grandfather come to him and say that upon death, the soul that has served the state in a truly just way will come up with us here and will dwell in the sort of the ethereal regions of the universe, of the sky. And that continues under, it basically seems to be the idea that, underlies the idea of the Roman emperors becoming deified. So I don't think it's all that, revolutionary. Anything else?
The acceptance of Christianity, especially by Constantine, to what do you attribute that? It's altruistic, but were the numbers?
Well, there are as many Constantines as there are people who write about Constantine. For some, he's, self-serving, that this is a veneer. For others, it really is part of him. There's some indication that his father, who was actually an emperor and was fighting in Britain at Eboracum, New York. Right? New York is Novum Eboracum. That when that decree was issued by Galerius and Diocletian for I'm going to say prosecution, he did not carry it out. Now, he may not have carried it out, again, for political reasons or military reasons. The life we have of Constantine by Eusebius, granted he's a Christian, treats him as, that this is a genuine, experience. Now, it does seem that the period right after the, quote, the battle that gained him and Licinius victory, when you go in Rome and you look at his arch, the arch up there doesn't have any mention of Christianity. It has some strange phrasing that seems reminiscent in a way of Symmachus. Some people think that Symmachus tried to build on that. And some people have argued that over time it developed, but that by the end of his life he is staunchly Christian. And gets himself involved in this controversy that was roiling Christianity, namely the nature of Christ, the vision between Athanasians and Arians, not with a Y, with an I. No, I think he was. I don't think it was just going with the wind. In fact, there's indications that the empire was still substantially non-Christian, right? And that many people would say it was really his backing that led to this. I should add that Theodosius sort of completes this process. He passes legislation that really forbids most pagan practices. And then the question becomes, well, what does it mean to be a pagan? Right? Because there are evidences of paganism into the 6th century. Right? And again, it seems to be that there were certain things that irritated people, like the presence of this altar and having to go through even the maybe hypocritical gesture of, of this slight worship, that will just boil over in certain places, so that this time pagan temples get attacked. Right? The most famous one, is the incident in Alexandria, the Serapeum, and so. This is a period of, especially. There's religious fervor, especially on the side of, and you can see where it's pent up on the side of Christians. The pagans really don't, I don't think don't share it. Some people have tried to say that this effort of Symmachus was part of a so-called Pagan Revival, and that the pagans saw that this was a chance now to reclaim what they had lost. If you read this latest book, which is by, this is kind of one of the prevailing authorities, a Brit named Cameron, he's been well known for discounting this, and he gives solid evidence to think that these were really two very different outlooks, views about religion, about the nature of life. Symmachus died peacefully, had good friendships with Christian writers like Ausonius, and since I think that he would be, well, then when, what's all this stush? I don't think he took it all that seriously. He doesn't seem to be really fueled by, Christian fervor. He's somewhat, there's an indication also superficial in a lot of other respects. He was a cultivator of books, but he doesn't seem to have read them all that much, especially the ancient books. Anybody else?
Is there any truth to the fact that the upper class of Romans, and I guess in particular Caesar, thought that he could use the state of religion to further his political and military ends, such as when he used to pay the augurers for a favorable augury before he set on a conquest?
I don't know that story. It may well be in Suetonius, which has things like that. This bit about the auguries, right? I don't think they really had to pay to get the answer that they wanted. In part, the answer could sort of be vague. There's a famous story about it's in the First Punic War. There's a sea battle that's about to take place, and the Roman admiral is told that the sacred chickens are not eating, and that this is a sign that this is not a good day to fight. And he, I think, some disparaging remark, like, orders them thrown overboard. Perhaps they're thirsty. Now, he does lose the battle, right? He does lose the battle, but I think the suggestion is, he probably should have thought of a more political way to go about this and doing it. No, honestly, I don't know that story that he paid to. I'm trying to think about. Caesar was a pontifex. He was the Pontifex Maximus, but I should add that the Emperor Gratian also was the first Roman emperor to reject being the Pontifex Maximus. Right? He let the Pope have that title.
Well, that story is in Rome. The DVD says.
Ah, well, then it must be true. But, I think that Rome is actually a good series. But it is HBO, right? It's not.
Given the vastness of the empire, for example, Caesar's tolerance of the Jews and their practices, to what extent would an edict or an attitude be either tolerated or ignored throughout parts of
Yeah, that's a good question. We certainly get the sense that some governors just disregarded, the word they got from, Rome. Others times it seems that they were carried out. The Jews are in Rome before Caesar. Right? Remember, the Romans and the Jews established relations back around the time of Hanukkah. That is, the Romans support the Jews in their revolt against Antiochus because the Romans are also opposed to Antiochus and his efforts to expand into Egypt. So if you read 1st and 2nd Maccabees, they have a good press. And just as Caesar will have a good press, generally in Jewish tradition. And there's clearly Jews, apparently in significant numbers in Rome in the 60s and 50s. Cicero reports about them, Horace mentions them, again, sometimes with disdain, but they clearly had synagogues, they had catacombs, they were burying their own dead. So it's not Caesar, it's just that, he, and conversely, the Jews backed the right horse. Right? He got help from the Jews, and Herod backed Augustus, and this is Herod of the the Gospels. He came out ahead, as opposed to Cleopatra, who backed the wrong horse in a way.
Well,
What do you mean tolerated?
Tolerated others, tolerated the Jews, tolerated the pagans.
Well, no, I mean, the ones who had power, I mean, they had to receive permission from the, the Senate or from a Roman official to be able to practice the religion without interference. But even again, the same thing applies. We don't know how effective, interference was. I mean, we do know that for this business with the as long as sort of there wasn't any unrest, any trouble, I think they had more important things on their plate, the Romans, than these other religions. Right? Except when, it became a matter of, like one of the first times we hear about it is that, there may well, that even in like Acts of the Apostles, Paul is brought to the notice of a Roman official because he and the Jews are scuffling. I mean, the Jews are complaining about the inroads, this is the way from a Christian standpoint. And when it comes to Gallio, who actually is a brother of the Roman philosopher Seneca, and he hears about this dispute, he sends them away and says, you thresh this out among yourselves. Right? That is, it wasn't serious enough, I think, in its political terms to really affect him. Right?
The reason I mentioned that is because if you look at Spain in 1492, the Jews, the Arabs, and the Muslims and the Catholics lived together. The moment that the Catholics kings take over, they don't tolerate the Jews.
Yeah.
They don't tolerate the others. So it seemed to be tied to power.
Oh, yeah, no, it's got to be, yeah, sure. I mean, it's a political decision. It's whoever, the reigning authority is, sure.
So if there were Gallup polls in the Roman times, and there would be like a Danforth Center for Religion and Politics, how would the trending changes in the relationship of politics and religion and the importance of religion for politics be compared to now?
Yeah. I think one interesting point or decisive point is actually in Augustine. The last work, or the major work he writes, is the City of God. Right? And at least the reason to write it is that now that Christianity was the established religion, why were things going downhill? This is an argument that Symmachus also makes, that there's famine. Ever since you got rid of the altar and the Vestal Virgins, we've had a famine. So when this had been that the city of Rome was sacked, right? It wasn't really sacked, in 410, but this was taken as an argument. Look what you've done to us. You've sapped us of our strength. So Augustine replies to that, but he's also got a reply in it to Christians who wanted to know, indeed, why has this happened? Now that we are worshiping the true God, why is it that his favor is being withheld from us? And Augustine's answer is that, well, we're just passing through here. We're what the Romans would call peregrini. It's the ancestor of the word pilgrims. We're just alien. We're like immigrants, resident immigrants. We have green cards. But our real home is the city of God in the next life. So we should not be overly concerned about what happens in this life. Obviously, we should pray for peace, and we should pray for, well-being and health and all the sort of desirable things. But we should not expect political success or military success, because that would be as if we had an insight into divine providence, and God's ways are mysterious. It also would be that if we did, if we were successful, you might think, well, it was a quid pro quo, the way the Romans thought. That is, we give you sacrifice, you give us dead Germans or dead Gauls or something like, that is, you give us military strength. Here it's, we worship you because you are the one true God and deserve worship, and because we're less than perfect, we hope in the next life that that we will be forgiven, right? So I think that's maybe where the dividing, I mean, even though obviously there's going to be this, as Garganigos make a strong connection between the state and religion, but I think there's the seeds in there of that. I mean, that didn't lead to that the state should be indifferent to religion, but that wasn't necessarily, it wasn't going to mean that there would be prosperity. But at the same time, you know, the state was expected, I mean, Augustine, to, for example, deal with, well, I shouldn't say the state, this funny relationship between religious authority and secular authority over the question of, you know, the heretics and the danger they posed to the solus populi, you know, the well-being of the people.
Could you please restate the translation of the first principle you have listed?
Surely, I mean, it's put into it's a kind of impersonally put, surely by one road alone, it cannot be reached to such a great mystery. To put it into English, surely such a great, and it's this word secretum, which is kind of odd, can't be reached by just one road. Some people have tried to find out where he was coming from in that, i.e., you know, there's a reference, that word is used also in a praise of the Emperor Constantine, secretum. But we don't know whether Constantine used that word or whoever was writing it used that word, secretum. But apparently there it means something like, you know, separated, you know, not readily available. And some people think it really means the ineffable. I mean, trying to talk about it, it's tied to Greek philosophy. There's, I mean, you know, of the making of books there is no end. Well, of the making of books about the end of antiquity there is also no end. I think I'm supposed to end. Well, my voice is about to end. Thank you very much.